Take that patch off, old man, before someone mistakes you for a soldier. Second Lieutenant Ryan Caldwell's voice cut across the north gate of Fort Halstead with the clean, hard edge of polished authority. Walter Mercer did not move. The morning wind tugged at his faded field jacket, carrying the scent of wet pavement, diesel exhaust, and freshly cut grass across the security lane. Beyond the steel barriers, black government sedans rolled toward the base's new operations center, their tires whispering over the asphalt. Flags snapped above the checkpoint. Radios murmured. Boots struck concrete in measured rhythm. Yet Walter stood perfectly still, one weathered hand resting near the black patch sewn over his heart. Its thread had gone gray with age. The emblem was barely visible now, a broken-winged eagle circling 3 pale stars. Caldwell stepped closer. At 25, he wore his uniform as if every crease were proof of command. His nameplate gleamed. His boots held a mirror shine. The silver bar on his collar caught the cold morning light each time he turned his head. "I gave you an order," he said. Walter's blue-gray eyes settled on him without anger. They held the kind of calm that made impatience feel childish. "General Whitaker asked me to come." Caldwell glanced toward the invitation scanner, then at the tablet in the guard booth. "Your name isn't on the list. Your letter has no verification code. And that insignia doesn't match any unit in the Army database." Walter held a worn envelope in one hand and a small wooden box in the other. The envelope bore Thomas Whitaker's name in dark blue ink. The box was no larger than a hardcover book, its corners rubbed smooth by years of handling. "The general will recognize both," Walter said. A staff sergeant standing near the barrier shifted his weight. Daniel Brooks had been watching the exchange in silence, his expression tightening each time Caldwell raised his voice. His gaze kept returning to the patch. Something about the emblem bothered him. It was not familiar, exactly. It felt remembered. Caldwell saw Brooks looking and mistook concern for agreement. "This is how stolen valor starts," he said loudly. Enough for the other guards to hear. "An old jacket, a mysterious patch, and a story nobody can verify." Walter's fingers closed gently over the edge of the wooden box. "Put the letter through your chain of command. You don't give instructions here." Caldwell reached for the patch. Walter's hand rose, not quickly, but with absolute purpose, covering the faded cloth. "That one stays with me." The young lieutenant's face hardened. To him, the gesture was defiance. To Walter, it was a promise kept for 51 years. Caldwell seized the patch and tore it free. Old thread snapped with a dry whisper. A strip of jacket fabric came away with it. The wooden box slipped from Walter's hand and struck the pavement with a hollow knock. Walter did not look at the lieutenant. He looked down at the box. For the first time, the stillness in his face cracked. Caldwell held the patch between 2 fingers as though it were something found in the dirt. "This doesn't belong on a military installation." Walter slowly lifted his eyes. The wind pressed the torn jacket against his chest. Neither did the men who died wearing it. Before Caldwell could answer, every radio at the checkpoint burst alive at once. Static snapped through the morning air, followed by a voice from base command, tense and unmistakably urgent. "All stations, execute immediate lockdown. By direct order of General Whitaker, seal every gate. No person and no vehicle leaves Fort Halstead." Steel barriers began to descend. Warning lights turned red. Caldwell stared at Walter, convinced he had just uncovered a threat. Walter stared only at the faded patch in the lieutenant's hand, as if the locked gates had opened a door to someplace much colder, much older, and impossible to forget. Red warning lights washed the checkpoint in slow pulses as the steel barriers settled into place. Engines idled on both sides of the gate. Drivers lowered their windows, confused by the sudden lockdown, while soldiers moved into position beneath the snapping flags. Ryan Caldwell pressed his radio closer to his mouth. "North Gate to command, confirm the reason for lockdown." Only static answered. He looked at Walter Mercer again, and suspicion sharpened every line of his face. Step away from the box. Walter remained focused on the small wooden case resting on the pavement. One corner had split from the fall, but the lid was still closed. "It is not dangerous," he said. "Then you will not mind leaving it there." Caldwell motioned to two guards. "Maintain distance until security arrives." Staff Sergeant Daniel Brooks stepped forward before either man could move. "Lieutenant, we should verify the letter first." Caldwell turned on him. "We have an unidentified civilian carrying a sealed container during a command event, and the entire base locks down seconds after we stop him. Verification can wait." Brooks glanced at the faded patch still pinched between Caldwell's fingers. The broken-winged eagle seemed darker beneath the red lights. "The lockdown order came from General Whitaker himself," Brooks said. "That is exactly why we should be careful about our assumptions." Walter bent slowly toward the box. Caldwell's hand dropped to the radio on his vest. "Do not touch it." Walter stopped. His back remained slightly bowed, one hand suspended a few inches above the worn wood. "There are names inside," he said quietly. "They have waited long enough." Caldwell gave a short, humorless laugh. "Names do not grant access to a restricted installation. Sometimes they build one." The words carried no challenge, but Brooks felt their weight. 12 minutes earlier, Walter had driven toward Fort Halstead in a faded blue pickup that looked older than most of the soldiers guarding the entrance. He had arrived alone, moving with the measured care of a man who understood what every step now cost him. On the passenger seat had rested the wooden box, the envelope, and a folded sheet of paper bearing 9 handwritten names. The base beyond the gate had been dressed for celebration. White chairs stood in perfect rows near the new operations center. A brass ensemble tested its instruments beneath a canvas awning. Banners announced the dedication of the Whitaker Tactical Operations Center, a building named for the general whose career had shaped the installation for 3 decades. Walter had studied those banners without pride or resentment. He had not come to see a building named after Thomas Whitaker. He had come to return something before memory outlived the men who carried it. At the checkpoint, the scanner rejected his handwritten invitation. Caldwell examined the envelope and found no barcode, no embossed seal, and no digital registration number. To him, it was only paper. To Walter, it was the final letter from the last living man who knew why 8 identification tags had never been entered into any public record. Now, with the gates sealed and the patch torn away, Walter straightened and looked beyond Caldwell toward the distant ceremony grounds. "Call the general," he said. Caldwell's jaw tightened. "You are in no position to issue orders." Brooks watched Walter's expression. There was no fear in it. Only urgency. Then his radio cracked to life. A voice from command spoke 6 words that drained the confidence from the checkpoint. "Locate Walter Mercer. Do not let him leave." For one suspended second, nobody at the north gate moved. The command voice had been clear, but its meaning hung between them like fog over cold ground. "Locate Walter Mercer. Do not let him leave." Ryan Caldwell heard confirmation of everything he feared. Daniel Brooks heard something entirely different. Walter heard only that Thomas Whitaker was still alive, still listening, and still carrying the weight of names the army had once buried beneath sealed files and forgotten orders. Caldwell lifted his chin and pointed toward the security booth. "Move him inside until military police arrive." Walter did not resist. He bent carefully, picked up the wooden box, and brushed a thin line of dust from its lid with his thumb. Brooks noticed the tenderness in the gesture. It was not how a man handled evidence. It was how a man handled a promise. "Lieutenant," Brooks said, keeping his voice low, "the order did not say detain him. It said do not let him leave. That could mean command is expecting him." Caldwell's expression tightened. The red warning light swept over his face, vanished, then returned. Staff Sergeant, I am responsible for this gate. I will not gamble base security on a feeling. Walter stepped beneath the checkpoint canopy. Rain from the previous night still clung to the metal roof, falling in slow drops that tapped against the concrete. Caldwell placed the faded patch on a stainless steel inspection table beside the rejected invitation. Under the harsh white light, the emblem looked even older. The eagle's outline had nearly disappeared. Only the 3 stars remained distinct, each sewn with thread that had once been silver. Caldwell opened the personnel search again and entered Walter's full name, date of birth, and service number from the identification card. The tablet paused. A gray circle turned across the screen. Then the same message appeared. Record restricted. Authorization required. Caldwell frowned. No rank. No unit. No discharge history. Walter stood beside the wall, the wooden box held against his chest. Some records were not made to be found at a gate. Convenient, Caldwell replied. So is claiming friendship with a general. I did not claim friendship. Walter's eyes shifted toward the distant operations center. He invited me because there are things a man should return before the last witness is gone. Brooks looked at the envelope. The handwriting was steady, formal, and unmistakably personal. Thomas Whitaker had written Walter Mercer's name himself. Caldwell saw Brooks studying it and slid the letter farther away. Do not touch anything until security takes custody. Walter's gaze moved to the patch. That is not yours to hold. Right now, it is part of an investigation. No, Walter said. His voice remained quiet, but the words settled with unusual force. It is part of 8 funerals that never happened. The booth seemed to grow smaller. Outside, drivers waited behind lowered barriers while soldiers redirected vehicles into inspection lanes. Somewhere across the base, the brass ensemble stopped playing. Brooks felt the memory return at last. 3 years earlier, during an inventory of the old command museum, he had seen a locked display case covered by a black cloth. A brass plate beneath it carried only 2 words. Night Eagle. When he asked about it, the curator had turned pale and told him the exhibit did not officially exist. Brooks looked again at the broken-winged eagle. Sir, he said to Walter, was Night Eagle a reconnaissance unit? Caldwell turned sharply. Walter studied Brooks for a long moment. It was 9 men sent through a gate that command had already decided to close. And General Whitaker? Walter lowered his eyes to the box. He was the youngest. Caldwell gave a dismissive breath, but less confidence stood behind it now. Stories are not credentials. Walter met his gaze. No. But the men inside this box are. At that moment, the tablet on the inspection desk chimed. The restricted record vanished. A black screen replaced it, followed by a gold command seal and a single line of text. Presidential clearance accepted. Caldwell stared as a photograph slowly loaded beneath Walter's name. It showed 9 young soldiers standing beside a snow-covered aircraft. Thomas Whitaker was among them. So was Walter Mercer, wearing the same faded patch that now lay torn on the table. The photograph filled the tablet screen beneath the gold command seal, its colors faded almost to gray. 9 young men stood in snow deep enough to cover their boots, their faces narrowed against a wind that seemed to reach through the image. Behind them rested an unmarked aircraft with frost silvering its wings. Walter Mercer stood near the center, straight-backed and broad-shouldered, his blue-gray eyes unchanged despite the half-century between that winter and this morning. Thomas Whitaker stood at the far end of the line, younger than Ryan Caldwell was now, wearing no stars and carrying none of the authority that would later follow his name. On every left shoulder was the broken-winged eagle. Caldwell stared at the screen, then at the patch on the table. The confidence in his posture did not disappear, but it shifted, as though a foundation beneath him had begun to settle. A photograph does not explain why the record is sealed, he said. Brooks moved closer to the tablet without touching it. Beneath the image, new text appeared one line at a time. Operation Winter Lantern. Presidential access restriction. Personnel status withheld. Mission file incomplete. Caldwell scrolled. But the remaining fields stayed black. Incomplete, he said quickly. There is still no proof of what happened. Walter looked through the checkpoint window toward the descending barriers. There was proof once. His gaze returned to the patch, and the faint scrape of old fabric against steel drew him backward through time. The inspection booth dissolved. The clean smell of rain and concrete gave way to pine smoke, freezing air, and the sharp bite of fuel. He was 28 again, standing inside a remote listening station built into a mountain pass somewhere official maps refused to name. Snow drove sideways beyond a reinforced steel gate. Warning lights pulsed red through the corridor. 9 men wore the Night Eagle patch. 8 were preparing to carry a wounded Thomas Whitaker toward an aircraft waiting 300 yards beyond the compound. Walter remained beside the manual gate controls, one gloved hand gripping a frozen lever. "We leave together," Whitaker had insisted, his voice weak but steady. Walter shook his head. The station's automated system had failed. The outer gate would remain open unless someone stayed behind long enough to close it by hand. An open gate would expose the extraction route and every man crossing it. Walter removed the patch from the shoulder of a teammate whose uniform had been left folded on a supply crate. He pressed it into Whitaker's hand. 8 names go home, he said. That is the mission now. Whitaker tried to rise, but the others held him steady. The youngest officer looked at Walter with a helpless fury that would follow him for the rest of his life. "Close the gate," Walter ordered. "Do not look back." The memory fractured into pieces, steel groaning against ice, radio voices fading, the white outline of the aircraft disappearing into snowfall, and Walter alone beneath the red lights as the final lock engaged. Then came silence. Not triumph. Not glory. Only the knowledge that 8 men would never stand in formation again. Walter blinked, and the mountain vanished. He stood once more beneath the checkpoint canopy, older, thinner, and holding the small wooden box against his chest. Caldwell was still studying the photograph. "You said 9 men went through the gate," Brooks said carefully. "How did you come back?" Walter's eyes settled on the torn strip of fabric hanging from his jacket. "I walked." Caldwell glanced up. "From where?" "Across 86 miles of winter that did not exist on any American map." The lieutenant's mouth opened, but no answer came. Walter stepped toward the inspection table. "You wanted credentials. Those 8 names are the only ones that matter." Caldwell instinctively placed his hand over the patch. Walter stopped. The air between them tightened. "Move your hand," Walter said. This time, Caldwell heard no request in the words. He lifted his fingers slowly. At that exact moment, the wooden box gave a soft click. The damaged latch released, and the lid opened just enough for 8 fire-darkened identification tags to slide into view. The 8 identification tags rested against the dark velvet lining of the box, their metal surfaces dulled by heat, weather, and more than half a century of silence. Each carried a name. Samuel Pike. Henry Lawson. Charles Bennett. Robert Hale. Edward Collins. James Porter. Michael Grant. William Reeves. Daniel Brooks read them without speaking. The names meant nothing to Ryan Caldwell, but the care with which Walter had arranged them made the small box feel heavier than any locked case in the security office. Beneath the tags lay a folded photograph, yellowed at the edges. Brooks lifted it only after Walter gave a quiet nod. The image showed the same 9 men beside the snow-covered aircraft, but this photograph had been taken closer. Their faces were clearer. Walter stood in the center with one hand on Thomas Whitaker's shoulder. The future general looked impossibly young, his expression serious beneath a wool-field cap. On the back, written in faded pencil, were 3 words and a date. Night Eagle Detachment. January 1975. Below them appeared a designation Brooks recognized from the tablet. Winter Lantern. Caldwell studied the picture, searching for some flaw that would restore the certainty he had possessed minutes earlier. Photographs can be copied, he said, though his voice had lost its edge. Brooks turned the image toward him. This paper is more than 50 years old. Age does not prove the story. Walter looked at the young lieutenant with neither anger nor contempt. That calm was becoming harder for Caldwell to face. You keep asking for proof, Walter said. But every time it appears, you move the line. Outside the booth, another convoy had stopped behind the sealed barrier. Senior officers stepped from their vehicles and looked toward the checkpoint, unaware that the dedication ceremony had been suspended because of the quiet man standing beneath its metal roof. Brooks examined the photograph again. A faint code had been written along the lower edge. He entered it into his secure terminal. The system rejected his credentials. He tried through the historical archive. Rejected again. Then he used the emergency command channel opened by the lockdown. The screen went black. A warning appeared in gold letters. Access restricted by executive authority. Report all unauthorized searches. Caldwell folded his arms. There. We cannot confirm anything. Brooks did not answer. He used his phone to photograph the front and back of the image, then attached a short message to the base chief of staff. Possible Night Eagle survivor at North Gate. General Whitaker visible in photograph. Patch removed during access dispute. He pressed send before Caldwell could stop him. You exceeded your authority, Caldwell said. No, Brooks replied. I used my judgment. Walter lowered the box lid, but before it closed, Caldwell noticed something beneath the photograph. A 9th place had been cut into the velvet. It was empty. Where is your identification tag? He asked. Walter's fingers paused on the lid. Thomas has it. Caldwell looked toward the operations center, nearly 2 miles beyond the gate. Why would the general have your tag? Walter's gaze drifted to the locked barrier. Because he believed I was never coming home. The words silenced the booth. Brooks imagined the young officer in the photograph carrying Walter's tag through decades of promotions, commands, ceremonies, and private remembrance. Then his phone vibrated. The response did not come from the chief of staff. It came from a number marked Command Priority 1. Brooks opened the message. General Whitaker has confirmed Walter Mercer. Preserve all items. Maintain respect. Command party en route. He looked up slowly. Caldwell saw the change in his face. What did they say? Brooks placed the phone on the inspection table where the lieutenant could read it. The color left Caldwell's expression. At the same moment, far across Fort Halstead, the public address system fell silent, the dedication music stopped, and a column of black command vehicles turned away from the ceremony grounds toward the north gate. The command vehicles moved across Fort Halstead in a tight black line, passing rows of empty chairs and the silent brass ensemble beneath the white awning. General Thomas Whitaker sat in the lead vehicle with Walter Mercer's identification tag pressed between his fingers. The metal had been polished smooth by decades of touch. He had carried it through every promotion, every transfer, every ceremony, and every night when winter wind against a window pulled him back to the mountain gate. Beside him, Colonel James Holloway studied the photograph Daniel Brooks had sent. Sir, the lieutenant removed the patch before confirming the identity. Whitaker kept his eyes on the road ahead. I heard. Military police are standing by. They will stand by. The general's voice was low, controlled, and more unsettling than anger. No one turns this into a spectacle. At the north gate, Ryan Caldwell read the command message again. Maintain respect. The words seemed simple, but they stripped away every defense he had built. He looked at the torn patch on the table, then at Walter's jacket where loose gray threads moved in the draft. "Mr. Mercer," he began, but Walter lifted one hand. "Do not apologize because a general is coming." Caldwell fell silent. Brooks remained beside the inspection desk, watching the road through the checkpoint window. A faint vibration moved through the concrete before the vehicles came into sight. Engines. Heavy, steady, approaching fast. Soldiers outside straightened. Conversations ended. Even the drivers trapped behind the barriers seemed to understand that whatever had caused the lockdown was about to arrive. Caldwell reached for the patch. "I should return this." Walter's eyes followed his hand. "Not yet." The lieutenant stopped. "Sir. You took it before you knew what it meant. Hold it until you do." Caldwell looked down at the broken-winged eagle. The fabric weighed almost nothing, yet his fingers had begun to tremble. Brooks opened the wooden box again and read the 8 names in silence. He noticed small marks beside each tag, scratched carefully into the velvet. Dates. Places. Years of remembrance arranged with military precision. Walter had not carried relics. He had carried a roll call. The lead vehicle appeared beyond the final curve. A staff car followed, then 2 military police vehicles with their lights dark. No sirens. No public announcement. Only the measured approach of authority that did not need noise. Caldwell's radio activated. "North Gate, command party arriving. All personnel hold position." He stepped outside with Brooks and Walter. The morning had turned colder. Clouds covered the sun, leaving the flag above them sharp against a pale sky. Walter stood without ceremony, the wooden box held at his side. He did not straighten his jacket or adjust his collar. He did not prepare to be recognized. He simply waited. The lead vehicle stopped 10 feet from the checkpoint. Before the driver could step out, the rear door opened. General Whitaker emerged in full dress uniform, for silver stars bright on each shoulder. Officers followed, but he left them behind. His gaze passed over Caldwell, Brooks, the sealed barriers, and the waiting convoy. Then he saw Walter. For a moment, the general did not move. 51 years collapsed between them. Whitaker's hand closed around the old identification tag in his pocket. Walter looked at him with the same quiet expression he had worn beside the frozen gate. The general walked forward slowly. Caldwell raised the patch, ready to explain, but Whitaker never looked at him. He stopped 3 steps from Walter, brought his heels together, and lifted his hand in a formal salute. Across the checkpoint, every soldier followed. Walter remained still as the entire North Gate fell silent. Then General Whitaker spoke, his voice carrying farther than any command. "Night Eagle 1, welcome home." Walter held the salute for one measured breath, then raised his own hand. The movement was slower than it had been 51 years earlier, but nothing about it was uncertain. General Thomas Whitaker lowered his hand only after Walter did. Around them, the North Gate remained silent. Ryan Caldwell stood with the faded patch resting across his open palm, his face drained of the confidence that had carried him through the morning. Whitaker finally turned toward him. His eyes settled first on the torn fabric at Walter's chest, then on the broken-winged eagle in the lieutenant's hand. "Who removed that patch?" he asked. Caldwell swallowed. "I did, General." Whitaker did not raise his voice. "Why?" The insignia was not recognized in the current database. Mr. Mercer had no verified access code, and I believed he might be misrepresenting his service. "Did he claim a rank?" "No, General." "Did he claim an award?" "No, General." "Did he threaten anyone?" "No, General." Each answer seemed to reduce the distance between authority and accountability. Whitaker stepped closer to the inspection table. Daniel Brooks opened the wooden box and placed it where the general could see. The 8 identification tags caught the gray morning light. Whitaker's expression changed. Not dramatically. His shoulders lowered by a fraction, and the command in his face gave way to something older. He reached into his coat and removed a 9th tag. Walter Mercer's name was stamped into the metal. Whitaker laid it in the empty space at the center of the box. It fit perfectly. For 51 years, he said, I carried this because I believed Walter Mercer had remained behind that gate. Caldwell looked from the tag to Walter. Whitaker continued. Night Eagle Detachment entered Winter Lantern with 9 men. Their mission was classified before they departed. Their losses were classified when it ended. Their families received incomplete answers. Their names were removed from public records. Walter stayed behind to secure the extraction route. He gave the rest of us the time to leave. The general looked at the sealed barrier beyond the checkpoint. I ordered these gates closed because no ceremony on this base was going to continue while the man who made my life possible was being treated like an intruder. The meaning of the lockdown moved through the soldiers in quiet waves. It had never been an order to contain Walter. It had been an order to stop Fort Halstead itself. Whitaker lifted the first tag from the box. Samuel Pike. Walter's voice was low. Present. Whitaker lifted the next. Henry Lawson. Present. One by one, they spoke the names. Charles Bennett. Robert Hale. Edward Collins. James Porter. Michael Grant. William Reeves. After each name, Walter answered the same way. Present. Not gone. Not erased. Present. When the final tag returned to its place, Whitaker closed the lid with both hands. Caldwell's fingers tightened around the patch. General, he said, I have no excuse. Walter looked at him. An explanation is not the same as an excuse. Caldwell lowered his eyes. Whitaker held out his hand. The patch. The lieutenant placed it carefully into the general's palm. Whitaker examined the torn threads, then looked toward Colonel James Holloway. Relieve Lieutenant Caldwell of Gate Command pending review. No public humiliation. No rushed judgment. We will investigate every decision made here. Caldwell removed his cap and stepped back. Walter spoke before military police could approach. Thomas. The general turned. Walter nodded toward the young lieutenant. Do not end his career before he learns what authority is for. Whitaker studied his old friend, then Caldwell. That decision will not be made today. He looked toward the locked gates. Open them. The barriers rose, but no vehicle moved. Every driver, officer, and soldier waited as Whitaker picked up the wooden box and walked beside Walter toward the heart of Fort Halstead. The road from the north gate to the ceremony ground stretched nearly 2 miles through Fort Halstead, lined with soldiers who had been pulled from their positions by the lockdown and were now standing in quiet formation. General Thomas Whitaker walked beside Walter Mercer instead of returning to his vehicle. He carried the wooden box with both hands. Colonel James Holloway followed several steps behind, while Daniel Brooks kept pace near the edge of the road. Walter moved slowly, but no one hurried him. The base had already waited 51 years. It could wait a few minutes more. As they approached the new operations center, the gathered officers and civilian guests rose from their chairs. They had expected a dedication speech, a ribbon cutting, and polished remarks about leadership. Instead, they saw a 4-star general walking beside an old man in a torn field jacket. Whitaker guided Walter toward the stage, then placed the wooden box on the podium where his prepared speech had been waiting. He removed the folded pages and set them aside without looking at them. The ceremony has changed, he said into the microphone. His voice carried across the rows of chairs and into the open doors of the new building. This facility was scheduled to bear my name. It will not. A murmur moved through the audience, then faded when Whitaker opened the box. Everything I accomplished after January of 1975 began with 9 men whose service was hidden by necessity and nearly erased by time. He lifted Walter's identification tag and held it where the front row could see. One of those men was declared missing in a report that remained sealed for decades. He crossed 86 miles of winter alone and returned without asking for recognition. Whitaker turned toward Walter. He carried the names of the others when the government could not speak them. Walter stood beneath the steel glare of the building's glass facade, one hand resting over the torn place on his jacket. He appeared smaller than the officers surrounding him, yet every eye remained fixed on him. Whitaker called Colonel Holloway forward. Together they removed the dark cloth covering the dedication plaque. Beneath it, the engraved words Whitaker Tactical Operations Center still shone in new brass. The general looked at the crowd. This name is incomplete. He turned to the facility's commander. Replace it. What designation, General? Whitaker glanced at Walter, but Walter shook his head. Once. Not mine, he said. Theirs. The general understood. Night Eagle Memorial Operations Center. No applause followed. Not at first. The words were too heavy for celebration. Whitaker took the faded patch from his pocket and laid it beside the 8 tags. This symbol was never authorized for public display. Today, it becomes part of this base. At the back of the gathering, Ryan Caldwell stood without his cap, escorted but not restrained. He watched as the patch he had dismissed was treated with greater care than any medal in the room. Walter noticed him. Their eyes met across the rows. There was shame in Caldwell's face, but Walter saw something else beneath it. Attention. The young lieutenant was finally listening. Whitaker stepped away from the microphone and held out a small sewing kit brought from the ceremonial support table. His hands, steady through years of command, struggled with the needle. Walter almost smiled. You were never good with field repairs. You never gave me enough practice, Whitaker replied. Before hundreds of silent witnesses, the general stitched the patch back onto Walter's jacket. The stitches were uneven, but they held. When he finished, Whitaker stood at attention. One by one, every uniformed person in the audience rose and saluted. Walter looked across the formation, then toward the 8 tags resting in the open box. He did not return the salute immediately. First, he spoke their names again, softly enough that only Whitaker could hear. Then he raised his hand, not for himself, but for the men who had finally come through the gate with him. The salute ended, but the silence remained. It settled over the ceremony grounds with the weight of snowfall, soft and complete. General Thomas Whitaker lowered his hand and looked at the uneven stitches holding the Night Eagle patch to Walter Mercer's jacket. They were not regulation. They were not neat. Walter touched them once and gave a small nod. They will hold, he said. Whitaker understood that Walter was speaking about more than thread. The 8 identification tags were transferred to a glass display case inside the operations center, but Walter asked that the case remain uncovered. No velvet curtain. No locked room hidden behind official language. The names were placed at eye level, where every new officer entering the building would have to pass them. Beneath the tags, a temporary card carried a simple sentence. 9 served. 1 returned carrying all of them. Colonel James Holloway arranged for the permanent plaque to be replaced before sunset. The general's name was removed without ceremony. By late afternoon, workers had installed a dark bronze plate bearing the new designation. Night Eagle Memorial Operations Center. Walter stood outside and watched the final screw turn into place. He showed no pride. Only relief. Across the courtyard, Ryan Caldwell waited beside Daniel Brooks. His silver lieutenant bars had been removed pending review, and his cap remained tucked beneath one arm. Whitaker had ordered him to attend every part of the dedication. Not as punishment. As instruction. When the workers stepped away, Caldwell approached Walter slowly. He stopped several feet from him. Mr. Mercer, I was wrong. Walter looked at the young man's empty collar. About what? Caldwell hesitated. About you. About the patch. About what authority allowed me to do. Those are three different mistakes. Yes, sir. The answer came without defensiveness. Walter studied him for a moment, then turned toward the north gate in the distance. You were assigned to protect this base. Yes, sir. Protection requires suspicion. Leadership requires knowing when suspicion has become pride. Caldwell lowered his eyes. I understand. Not yet, Walter said. But you might. He reached into his pocket and removed a short length of faded silver thread left from the repair. He placed it in Caldwell's palm. Keep that until you know the difference between guarding a gate and deciding who deserves to pass through it. Caldwell closed his fingers around the thread as carefully as he had finally learned to hold the patch. Near sunset, Walter prepared to leave. Whitaker offered him a staff car, an escort, and a place of honor at the command residence. Walter declined all three. He had arrived in his old blue pickup, and that was how he intended to go home. Whitaker walked with him to the north gate. The barriers were raised. The warning lights were dark. Soldiers stood in two quiet lines along the road. Ryan Caldwell had returned to the checkpoint, not as commander, but as an observer under Brooks's supervision. When Walter approached, Caldwell stepped forward and stood at attention. He did not speak. He did not attempt another apology. He raised his hand in a precise salute. Walter stopped. The wind moved through the trees and lifted the edge of the faded patch over his heart. For an instant, the gate before him was steel and ice again, and 8 young voices waited beyond it. Then the memory softened. Walter returned the salute. He climbed into his pickup and drove through Fort Halstead's open gates while every soldier remained still. Whitaker watched until the blue truck disappeared beyond the final curve. Some symbols fade because time touches everything. What they stand for survives when someone remembers to treat them with honor.